In this step, let's deviate from our hands-on steps. Let's do some theory. What we would be discussing is the architectures of different web applications. We have been developing web applications for more than 2 decades now. So it's 20 years, I think, approximately the timeline for which we have been developing web applications using Java. During this phase, there have been a lot of changes in the architecture of these web applications. We are restricting our discussion to Java web applications. So anything I refer to is typically, you can assume it's about Java web applications. A typical Java web application request flow would look something of this kind. From the browser, you send a request. The request comes to the web server, which can be something like Tomcat. It can be an application server like WebSphere or WebLogic. And in the web server, we would have a lot of components which would be deployed. If we are using Java EE, basic Java EE, then the components which would be deployed in the web server would be basic servlet. So you would have a servlet 1 handling one request, servlet 2 would be handling another request, and so on. And you would have multiple views. The view can be JSP. There are other view technologies like FreeMarker, Velocity. So that's kind of the entire request flow in a standard in a normal JEE application. We would want to discuss the evolution of architecture from where we came down here. The important terminologies used to describe the architectures are Model 1 architecture, Model 2 architecture. Sometimes it's also referred to as MVC, and there is now a modified MVC architecture which is based on the front controller. So those are the three we are going to discuss. So we have a Model 1 architecture, Model 2 architecture, and Model 2 modified architecture. What is Model 1 architecture? In the Model 1 architecture, JSPs were everything. As we already know, JSPs are nothing but servlets. JSPs, we write it as almost HTML-like things with little bit of dynamic content, but at the end, a JSP is also a servlet. So in a Model 1 architecture application, which I'm talking about, let's say 1.5 decades back or 2 decades back, when Java first came in, all the applications used to be based on JSPs. There were no servlets at all. So there were absolutely no servlets, or there was no concept called servlets or controllers. All the logic used to be in JSP. So in the form, you directly give a link to the JSP so that the request goes to the JSP handles the request, and it redirects to another JSP. So that's basically how the entire flow was. The entire flow was based on JSPs. And this was not really a successful model because JSPs are not really good places to write business logic, like controller logic, business logic. All this kind of thing is real Java code. And in JSPs, it's little tricky to write Java code. I would rather write Java code in a controller. In the JSP, I would rather have the view code. So when we have a mix of both in the JSPs, it becomes really difficult to maintain. And that's the reason why the Model 1 architecture did not really succeed. So very quickly, the Model 1 architecture got outdated, and we went into something called a Model 2 architecture. In the Model 2 architecture, we had something called a MVC pattern, Model View Controller. This might look complex, but it's quite simple actually. So what is a controller? A controller is nothing but a servlet. So this is a servlet. What does the servlet typically do? Like, for example, the login servlet in the Java EE application that we developed, it accepts a request parameter and it redirects to a view. So that's basically what a controller does. It controls the flow. View is nothing but a JSP. So in our example, we were looking at login.jsp. Login.jsp is a view. It takes whatever information is in the model and it would show it to the screen. So the example for this would be login servlet.java. And the model, a very good example for this would be the todo.java that we have created. So what we do in the controller typically is we would get the data from the database, populate the model. So the controller would populate the model and then redirect to the view, and the view would display that particular data. So the controller is responsible for populating the model. So controller, all that it does is it gets the data and populates it into the model. The model might be session or request attributes, or like in Spring MVC, it's really a model. I mean, it's called model in Spring MVC. So that's the controller's job. The view's job would be to take the data from the model, take the to-do from the model and show it on the screen. However it wants to render, it can do that. In the controller, typically the things which are used are servlets, or in some of the frameworks, these are called controllers as well. We'll discuss how it's in the Spring MVC a little later. We already know that. Actually, this is more like a revision of what we already know. And in the view, there are multiple kinds of view technologies present. One of them which we already looked at is JSP. There are other view technologies like Velocity is a templating language. You have other view technologies like FreeMarker. It's another templating language. The advantage that the new view technologies provide is the fact that in the new view technologies, you will not be able to write any Java business logic, or it's very difficult to write Java business logic in the view. In a JSP, we have this concept called scriptlets, which lets us to write a lot of Java code very easily, and thereby the view might get polluted. So it might have view logic and also the business logic, and we don't want that to happen. And that's why in some of the modern applications, we are tending towards using Velocity or FreeMarker as a view. And also these days, we are moving more towards RESTful web applications where we don't really care about the view, and the view is taken care of by a front-end framework like AngularJS. And the model is typically your business objects. In our application, to-dos are our business objects. So to-do is the model for us. And in a complex application, there might be a huge domain model available, which would be acting as a model. So that's the MVC architecture. You can look at frameworks like Struts and also Spring MVC. They follow this model at a high level. I mean, there are small modifications in each of the frameworks in how they use this model, but this is at a high level, this is the model they use. And in Spring MVC, we have a small modification of the model to architecture in that we use something called a friend controller pattern. In a normal MVC pattern, what happens is, let's say I have two servlets, login.servlet, to-do servlet, and let's have another servlet, servlet tree. Once user does an action on the view, the request can go directly to any of these servlets. So it can either, if I say login.do, it goes to login servlet. If I say to-do.do, it goes to the to-do servlet. If I give, probably there's a URL for servlet tree, and if I give that URL, then it goes to servlet tree. So the request would directly go to that particular servlet. However, in frameworks like Spring MVC, they have something called a friend controller. So that's the dispatcher servlet, for example, in the Spring MVC. So what would happen is all the requests would first go to the dispatcher servlet, and then the dispatcher servlet would decide which ones to call. For example, in our example, we have a login controller and a to-do controller. So when I click a view link on the, a link on the view, what happens? The request first goes to the dispatcher servlet, and the dispatcher servlet then decides which controller to invoke. And that pattern where every request goes to one servlet, irrespective of the kind of a request, that's called a friend controller pattern. The advantage of friend controller pattern is that now everything goes to that servlet. So it would be easy to control what's going in. Let's say I want to implement some authentication, or I want to add any additional feature, add logging and that kind of stuff. I can directly implement that in the dispatcher servlet, or there are ways we can do that, but that's the main advantage of the friend controller pattern. Everything goes to the same place, so you can control what's going in, what's going out, and you can easily add and remove functionalities as needed. Whereas in the case of the MVC, normal MVC pattern, the request goes to different servlets directly, and it might really become a little difficult. We can introduce concepts like interceptors, things like logging and stuff, but it's much easier to do that kind of stuff in a friend controller pattern. So there you go. That's a high level overview of the different architectures of Java web application. And if a few of the terminologies in this particular step are a little confusing to you, don't worry. We use a lot of complex terminologies in this particular step. This is just to get you introduced to those terms and nomenclature. Don't worry about it if you are not able to catch some of them. I would really recommend to watch this step again if there is a confusion. And until the next step, bye bye.